By the time of Catherine's death in 1796, Russia had passed through 3 centuries of extraordinary development. It had won independence and constructed a long central state, through one that had to maintain a balance with the local political and economic interests of a powerful nobility. It had brought new elements into Russia's culture and economy, in part by borrowing from the West, and it had extended its control over the largest land empire in the world, map 18.3. In the east, it bordered China, where in 18th century Amur River agreement set new frontiers. A tradition of careful but successful military aggrandizement had been established, along a real pioneering spirit of settlement. It is no wonder that not long after 1800, a perceptive French observer, Alexis de Tocqueville, spelled Tocqueville, likened the expanded and increasingly important Russian to the new country emerging in the Western Hemisphere, the United States of America, the 2 giants of future world history. Themes in early modern Russian history. Because of its great estates, its local political power, and its service to the state, the Russian nobility maintained a vital position in Russian society. In Russia and Eastern Europe generally, land nobles tended to be divided between a minority of great magnates, spelled Magnates, who lived in major cities and provided key cultural patronage, and small landowners whose culture was less westernized and whose lifestyle was much less opulent. Serfdom, the life of East Europe's masses. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the power of the nobility over the serfs increased steadily. Before the Mongol conquest, Russian peasants had been largely free farmers with a legal position superior to that of their medieval Western counterparts. After the expulsion of the Tatars, however, increasing numbers of Russian peasants fell into debt and had to accept servile status to the noble landowners who they could not repay. They retained access to much of the land, but not primary ownership. The Russian government actively encouraged this process from the 16th century onward. Serfdom gave the government a way to satisfy the nobility and regulate peasants when the government itself lacked the bureaucratic means to extend direct controls over the common people. As new territories were added to the empire, the system of serfdom was extended accordingly, sometimes after a period of free farming. An act of 1649 fixed the hereditary status of the serfs so that people born to that station could not legally escape it. Laws passed during the 17th and 18th centuries tied the serfs to the land and increased the legal rights of the landlords. Serfs of the estates of Eastern Europe were also taxed, policed, and even sold by their landlords. In Russia, whole villages were sold as manufacturing labor, a process Peter the Great actively encouraged so as to spur manufacturing. Peasants were not literally slaves. They continued to use village governments to regulate many aspects of their lives, relying more heavily on community ties than their counterparts in the western countryside. Yet, most peasants were illiterate and quite poor. They paid high taxes or obligations in kind, and they owed extensive labor service to the landlords or the government, a source not only of agricultural production, but also of mining and manufacturing. The labor obligation tended to increase steadily. Both the economic and the legal situation of the peasantry continued to deteriorate. Although Catherine the Great sponsored a few model villages to display their enlightenment to Western-minded friends, she turned the governments of the serfs over to the landlords more completely than ever before. A law of 1785 allowed landlords to punish harshly any serfs convicted of major crimes or rebellion. By 1800, half of Russia's peasantry were in serf to the landlords, and much of the other half owed comparable obligations to the state. Russia was setting up a system of serfdom very close to outright slavery, in that serfs could be bought and sold, gambled away, and punished by their masters. The system was a very unusual case in which a people essentially enslaved many of its own members, in contrast to most slave systems which focused on outsiders. Rural conditions in many other parts of Eastern Europe were similar. Nobles maintained estate agriculture in Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere. Estate agriculture, trade, and dependence. In Russia, the nobility used the estate agricultural system to sustain their political power and their aristocratic status, which derived from command over land and people, not trade or commerce. This focus stifled social mobility and urbanization, which were drivers of economic growth in the West. In between serfs and landlords, there were few layers of Russian society. Cities were small, and 95% of the population remained rural. The manufacturing that existed took place in the countryside, so there were no well-defined artisan class. Government growth encouraged some non-noble bureaucrats and professionals. Small merchant groups existed as well, although most of Russia's European trade was handled by Westerners posted to the main Russian cities and relying on Western shipping. The nobility, concerned about potential social competition from both bureaucrats and businessmen, prevented the emergence of a substantial merchant class. The bulk of the population was increasingly composed of unserved farmers who had little opportunity for social or economic development. Inevitably, the intensification of estate agriculture and serf labor pursued by the nobility led to Eastern Europe's growing economic subordination to the West. Coerced labor, coerced is spelled C-O-E-R-C-E-D. I'm gonna pronounce it coerced. I might have said it a different way earlier, but I'm gonna pronounce it coerced. Coerced labor was used to produce grain surpluses purchased by Western merchants to feed the growing cities of Western Europe. In return, Western merchants brought in manufactured goods, including the luxury furnishing and clothing essential to the aristocratic lifestyle. This growing dependence on Western markets and Western manufactured goods is comparable in some respects with developments in Latin America, see Chapter 19. Though Eastern Europe was unique in its lack of merchant class or entrepreneurial values that could have produced more balanced economic growth. Russia's social and economic system worked well in some respects. It produced enough revenue to support an expanding state and empire. Russia was able to trade in furs and other commodities with areas in Central Asia outside its boundaries, which meant that its export economy was not totally orientated toward the more dynamic West. It underwrote the aristocratic magnates and their glittering westernized culture. The system, along with Russia's expansion, yielded significant population growth. Russia's population doubled during the 18th century to 36 million. For an empire burdened by a harsh climate in most regions, this was no small achievement. Despite periodic famines and epidemics, there is no question that the overall economy had advanced. Yet the system suffered from important limitations. Most agricultural methods were highly traditional, and there was little motivation among the peasantry for improvement because increased production usually was taken by the state or the landlord. Landlords debated agricultural improvements in their academies, but when it came to time to increase production, they concentrated on squeezing the serfs. Manufacturing lagged behind Western standards, despite the important extension developed under Peter the Great. Social unrest. Russia's economic and social system led to protest. By the end of the 18th century, a small but growing number of Western-oriented aristocrats, such as Radishchev, were criticizing the regime's backwardness, urging measures as far-reaching as the abolition of serfdom. Here were the seeds of a radical intelligentsia, spelled Intelligentsia, that, despite government repression, would grow with time. More significant still were the recurring peasant rebellions. Russian peasants, for the most part, were politically loyal to the Tsar, but they harbored bitter resentments against their landlords, whom they accused of taking lands that were rightfully theirs. Periodic rebellions saw peasants destroy manorial records, seize land, and sometimes kill landlords and their officials. Peasant rebellions had occurred from the 17th century onward, but the Pugachev rebellion of the 1770s was particularly strong. Pugachev, figure 18.5, a Cossack chieftain who claimed to be the legitimate Tsar, promised an end to serfdom, taxation, and military conscription, along with the abolition of the landed aristocracy. His forces roamed over southern Russia until they were finally defeated. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in case and cut into quarters in a public square. The triumph of Catherine and the nobility highlighted the mutual dependence of government and the upper class, but did not end protest. Radishchev, finding peasants barely able to work their own plots of land, and sometimes tortured to work harder, thought he saw the handwriting on the wall. Tremble, cruel-hearted landlord, on the brow of each of your peasants I see your condemnation written. Russia and Eastern Europe. Russian history did not include the whole of Eastern Europe after the 15th century. Regions west of Russia continued to form a fluctuating borderland between Western Europe and Eastern European influences. Even in the Balkans, under Ottoman control, growing trade with the West sparked some new cultural exchange by the 18th century, as Greek merchants, for example, picked up many Enlightenment ideas. Areas such as present-day Poland or the Czech, spelled Czech, I'm going to pronounce it Czech, and Slavic religions operated more fully within the Western cultural orbit. The Polish scientist Copernicus was an early participant in fundamental discoveries in what became the scientific revolution. Western currents such as the Reformation also echoed in parts of East Central Europe, such as Hungary. At the same time, many smaller Eastern European nationalities lost political autonomy during the early modern era. Hungary, freed from the Ottomans, became part of the German-dominated Habsburg Empire. This empire also took over the Czech lands, then called Bohemia. Prussian territory pushed eastward into Polish areas. The decline of Poland was particularly striking. In 1500, Poland formed in 1386 by union from Russia. Polish cultural life, linked with the West through shared Roman Catholicism, flourished in the 16th century. By 1600, however, economic political setbacks mounted. Polish aristocrats, charged with electing the king, began deliberately choosing weak figures. As in Russia, urban centers and thus a merchant class were lacking. The aristocratic parliament vetoed any reform efforts until late in the 18th century, after Poland began to be partitioned by its more powerful neighbors. The eclipse of Poland highlighted Russian emergence on the European as well as the Eurasian stage. Global connections. Russia and the world. From a world history standpoint, Russia's emergence as a key player both in Europe and Asia was a crucial development in the early modern period. Today, Russia spans 10 time zones and much of its territory had been acquired by the late 18th century. By this point, Russia was effecting diplomatic and military developments in Europe and in the Middle East through its frequent battles with the Ottoman Empire and in East Asia. It had gained a direct hold in Central Asia. The spread of Russian claims to Alaska and expeditions even to Hawaii hinted at an even larger role. At the same time, early modern Russia did not become a major player in the process of proto-globalization. Its exports of grain and raw materials to Western Europe were significant, but it deliberately did not seek a leading commercial role. This was a different kind of empire from those that Western nations were building, but it had huge impact. That is it for Chapter 18.